Did people really die at 30 in the Middle Ages? Tonight, we step into one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of history. The claim that people in the Middle Ages only lived to about 30 years old. You've heard it before. It sounds shocking. It sounds tragic. And like most ideas that sound that neat, it's deeply misleading. So dim the lights. Let the world slow down. And let's untangle what medieval life expectancy actually meant and what it absolutely did not. The idea that medieval people only lived to 30 comes from a misunderstanding of one quiet but powerful word: average. Life expectancy is not a countdown clock. It doesn't mean adults collapsed on their 30th birthday and politely exited history. What it really measures is how dangerous the beginning of life was. In the Middle Ages, birth was not a celebration. It was a risk. Childbirth took place without anesthesia, without antiseptics, and without any real understanding of infection. Midwives relied on experience, prayer, and hope, often all at once. If complications appeared, there were no emergency surgeries, no sterile tools, and no second chances. And even when a child survived birth, the danger had only begun. Infancy was a battlefield. Disease, cold, malnutrition, and infection arrived immediately. Many children did not survive long enough to be named, not because parents didn't care, but because naming a child who might not survive the week was emotionally devastating. When large numbers of children die very young, averages collapse. They sink even if adults later live long lives. That quiet math is the foundation of the myth. If a village lost half its children before adulthood, but the survivors lived into their 50s or 60s, the average would still look horrifying, not because adults were weak, but because childhood was merciless. And childhood, in the medieval world, was the most dangerous phase of life. Children worked early. They lived around animals, sharp tools, open fires, rivers, and carts. There were no safety standards. A fall, a fever, or a small cut could quietly end a life. Without antibiotics or germ theory, no one knew when something minor had become fatal until it was too late. Yet despite this, medieval parents loved their children deeply. There is a modern myth that frequent loss made parents emotionally distant. The evidence says the opposite. Letters, prayers, graves, and wills reveal intense grief. What medieval parents practiced was not indifference, it was emotional restraint. They loved carefully. They celebrated milestones quietly. They hoped in measured doses. Not because they felt less, but because feeling everything fully, all the time, would have destroyed them. Here's the part most people never hear. If you survived childhood in the Middle Ages, your odds improved dramatically. Not magically. This was still a harsh world, but significantly enough to change the story entirely. Many adults lived into their 50s. Quite a few reached their 60s. Some even reached their 70s, at which point the village collectively decided you were either blessed, cursed, or secretly immortal. Old age existed. It simply wasn't evenly distributed. Adults who survived childhood were not fragile. They were hardened. They had already endured hunger, disease, and exhaustion. They worked, married, raised families, complained about their joints, and insisted the younger generation was lazy. In other words, adulthood looked surprisingly familiar. Disease never disappeared. It hovered constantly. Without germ theory, illness felt random and personal. One person survived a fever. Another didn't. Doctors confidently applied treatments based on bodily humors, bloodletting, purging, sweating, and recorded both recovery and death as proof of success. Sometimes, doing nothing was safer. But that was difficult to explain when a man in robes was holding a knife and looking hopeful. Diet mattered deeply. Most peasants lived on bread, porridge, and whatever survived the harvest. In good years, bodies adapted. In bad years, hunger weakened immune systems and opened the door to disease. Famine rarely killed alone. It arrived with illness. Work finished what hunger and disease began. Medieval labor was constant, physical, and unforgiving. Injuries accumulated. A twisted ankle never fully healed. A damaged back became permanent. Work didn't usually kill quickly. it shortened lives quietly. For women, the risk was greater. Pregnancy and childbirth added recurring danger that never paused. Each birth was another gamble with the same body, already strained by labor and malnutrition. Some women survived many pregnancies and lived long lives. Others did not. Life expectancy numbers reflect this imbalance, even when the stories behind them are forgotten. Violence also played its role. Not constant war, but instability. Raids, feuds, and sudden conflicts flared unpredictably. Young men were especially vulnerable, further skewing statistics. And above all, social class tilted the odds. Peasants worked harder, ate worse, and lived closer to danger. Nobles lived more comfortably, though disease did not respect titles. Clergy often lived the longest, supported by routine, shelter, and steady food. When old age arrived, it carried status. Elders were living memory. They remembered past famines, wars, and mistakes. They were respected and sometimes blamed, which is still how old age works today. So, what does medieval life expectancy actually tell us? Not that people lived short, meaningless lives, but that the world was brutally uneven. Life expectancy measures risk, not human fragility. Medieval people were not biologically weaker than us. They were environmentally overwhelmed. They didn't plan decades ahead. They planned for winters survived, for children grown strong enough to help. Each year lived was an achievement. And yet, they loved. They celebrated. They argued. They remembered. They endured. The true cruelty of medieval life was not dying young. It was never knowing when death would arrive. Some lives were short and unfair. Others were long and heavy with experience. Statistics flatten these lives into a single misleading number. So when you hear that medieval people only lived to 30, remember this. That number does not describe how long people lived. It describes how dangerous it was to be born. And the fact that so many endured anyway, that is not a story of weakness. It is a story of stubborn, unmistakable humanity. Stoicism, a philosophy that was meant to be lived. Stoicism was never a theory meant only to be agreed with. It was a way of living one disciplined day at a time. Its goal was not comfort, but clarity. Stoicism did not disappear with the fall of Rome. It moved forward quietly, not loudly. As older philosophies collapsed, Stoicism changed its clothing, but not its soul. As Christianity spread across the Mediterranean world, its thinkers encountered Stoic ideas everywhere, in education, language, and moral teaching. They rejected Stoic theology, but they could not ignore its psychological discipline. In the deserts of Egypt and Syria, early Christian monks faced the same problem Stoics had wrestled with for centuries: how to control the mind. Isolation did not bring peace. It intensified fear, anger. Thinkers like Evagrius Ponticus developed systems for monitoring thoughts that closely resembled Stoic psychology. Disturbing thoughts, he taught, arrive uninvited, but accepting them is optional. This mirrors the Stoic principle of withholding assent. Thought itself is not sin. Agreement is. Christian asceticism adopted Stoic emotional discipline but redirected its aim. Where Stoics sought harmony with reason and nature, monks sought harmony with God. Yet the methods overlapped. Attention to thought, control of desire, acceptance of hardship, inner stability. Stoic language shaped Christian morality. Patience, endurance, humility, and self-control echoed Stoic virtues almost directly. Indifference to external status reappeared as rejection of worldly honor. Wealth, reputation, and power became distractions, not achievements. Christianity softened Stoicism's severity. Where Stoics often aimed for emotional invulnerability, Christian thinkers allowed grief and compassion, but warned against being ruled by them. The goal shifted from self-sufficiency to inner obedience, but discipline remained central. This fusion preserved Stoicism through a cultural transition that erased many pagan schools entirely. Temples closed. Philosophical lineages broke. But Stoic practices survived inside monasteries, sermons, and moral instruction. The name faded, The method endured. Mental clarity through restraint, acceptance of suffering, and mastery of judgment became Christian virtues. By medieval Europe, few remembered Zeno, but the Stoic mind was still at work. Stoicism did not need to survive as a label. Its strength was practical. In the modern world, Stoicism returned through psychology. Its core insight, that suffering comes more from interpretation than events, resurfaced in therapeutic language. The metaphysics disappeared. The mechanism remained. Modern cognitive therapy echoes a radical Stoic idea. Thoughts are not facts. Emotional distress follows judgment, not circumstance. Identify distorted thinking, correct it, and clarity can return. This is Stoicism in clinical clothing. After war, displacement, and mass trauma, modern thinkers ask the same question Zeno once asked. What remains when everything external is taken? Viktor Frankl answered, meaning not comfort sustains survival. Freedom exists in the space between stimulus and response. Today, Stoicism resurfaces as a counterweight to outrage, comparison, and anxiety. It does not promise happiness. It promises resilience. And that distinction matters. Classical Stoicism was never just about optimization. It tied clarity to ethics, honesty, fairness, courage, and responsibility. Clarity without ethics was considered dangerous. Stoicism is not emotional suppression. It is emotional proportion. It asks us to feel what is appropriate for as long as it is useful, without allowing emotion to become identity. What Stoicism ultimately offers is not happiness, but reliability. A Stoic becomes someone others can depend on in crisis, not because they feel nothing, but because they do not break. 2,000 years later, Stoicism remains what it always was. A philosophy for people who cannot afford illusion but still want to live well, the quiet strength that remains. Stoicism endures because it never promised escape. It never offered a world without pain, loss, or uncertainty. Instead, it offered something far rarer, a way to remain intact while facing them. In every era where Stoicism resurfaced, the same conditions were present: instability, pressure, fear, and noise. The philosophy did not attempt to eliminate these forces. It taught how to meet them without breaking. At its core, Stoicism redefines strength. Strength is not dominance. It is not emotional intensity. It is not constant confidence or control over others. Strength, in the Stoic sense, is the ability to remain steady when conditions deteriorate. It is the refusal to let fear dictate action, anger decide judgment, or desire override reason. This strength is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not perform, but it lasts. Mental clarity in Stoicism is not a permanent state of calm. It is a practice of alignment. Alignment between judgment and reality, between values and behavior, between what one wants and what one accepts. When these are in conflict, the mind fractures. When they align, resilience emerges. Stoicism places responsibility back where it belongs, not on fate, not on others, not on circumstances, but on judgment. This is demanding. It removes the comfort of blame, but it also restores agency. If distress arises from interpretation, then clarity is possible through discipline. The world may remain harsh, but the inner response can improve. This is why Stoicism resists simplification. It is not positive thinking. It is not denial. It is not optimism for its own sake. Stoicism asks for realism paired with restraint. It acknowledges pain without amplifying it. It allows grief without surrendering reason. It accepts impermanence without despair. In a culture that often equates emotional expression with authenticity, Stoicism can appear cold. But its aim is not emotional erasure. It is emotional proportion. The Stoics understood this danger. That is why discipline was never merely psychological. It was moral. The goal was not feeling better, it was becoming better. This is also why Stoicism has been misunderstood as emotional numbness. In reality, it demands emotional awareness at a higher level. It requires noticing subtle shifts of judgment before they harden into habit. It requires courage to sit with discomfort rather than escape it. It requires humility to accept what cannot be controlled without resentment. Stoicism does not ask you to feel less. It asks you to feel accurately. This accuracy creates reliability. A Stoic becomes someone others can depend on, not because they are unaffected, but because they are not overwhelmed. In moments of crisis, when panic spreads and judgment collapses, this steadiness becomes invaluable. Reliability is a quiet virtue. It does not draw attention, but history rarely celebrates such people. It remembers conquerors, innovators, and disruptors. But societies survive because of those who remain functional under pressure. Stoicism trains for that role, and that is why it never disappeared. It moved through monasteries when schools closed. It survived inside moral language when philosophy was forbidden. It resurfaced in psychology. This does not make suffering vanish. It makes suffering intelligible. Stoicism does not offer happiness as an end goal. Happiness is too fragile, too dependent on circumstance. Instead, it offers coherence, a way to remain aligned when life pulls in different directions. Coherence between thought and action, between belief and behavior, between acceptance and effort. When coherence exists, the mind steadies. When it breaks, anxiety fills the gap. Stoicism trains coherence. 2,000 years after its birth beneath a painted, it is a philosophy of endurance. And endurance, when paired with clarity, becomes dignity. Stoicism does not shout. It does not promise transformation overnight. It does not sell hope wrapped in certainty. It offers something harder and more honest, a way to stand upright in a world that will not stop shaking. That is why it survives. Not because it is ancient, but because it is useful. Different centuries. Same question. How to live well when certainty is impossible. Stoicism continues to answer. Quietly, persistently, without spectacle, not with comfort, but with clarity, lust, and despair. The chaos inside often felt worse than the chaos outside. Stoic techniques offered solutions.